June 4, 1942. 10:22 a.m. Flight deck of the JN Akagi, 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joy Tamanega clutched his flight roster with hands still shaking from his bombing run over Midway. Through the carrier's bridge windows, he could observe the organized turmoil below. Type 99 dive bombers being maneuvered aside. Type 97 torpedo planes having their torpedoes swapped for 800 kilograms bombs. Fuel hoses coiled across the deck like steel serpents. In his pocket, a letter to his wife remained incomplete, its last line reading, "The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is assured." He could not foresee that at this precise moment American aircraft were already converging on his position. He could not imagine that the next 11 minutes would decide not just the fate of 4 Japanese carriers, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. He could not know that everything the Imperial Japanese Navy assumed about carrier warfare, American capabilities, and their own invincibility was about to be shattered in the span of a cup of tea. Below him on the flight deck, aircraft mechanic petty officer First Class Kanem Harada worked with frantic efficiency, supervising the weapons conversion that Admiral Nagumo had ordered just minutes earlier. They had trained for this, transitioning from land attack to ship attack ordnance, but never under such pressure, never with scouts reporting conflicting intel, never with the eerie feeling that something was gravely wrong, despite all signs of Japanese dominance. At 10:20, the Japanese carriers had been the masters of the Pacific. Their aircraft were poised to destroy what they believed was the sole American carrier in the region. 10:31, 3 of the 4 carriers would be doomed, transformed into burning steel coffins by American dive bombers that seemed to materialize from the sky itself. Those 11 minutes would reveal truths about modern naval warfare that neither navy fully grasped until they unfolded in real time over the Pacific's endless blue expanse. The mathematics of Japanese naval dominance seemed unassailable on the morning of June 4, 1942. Admiral Tuchi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the most formidable carrier striking force ever assembled. For fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 248 aircraft manned by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, Darwin, and Ceylon. Men who had sunk more Allied warships in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all previous conflicts combined. Opposing them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the last hastily repaired from damage that should have required 3 months to fix, made barely seaworthy in 72 hours by 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had 233 aircraft, most piloted by aviators who had never faced combat, many with less than 300 flight hours total. The torpedo bomber squadrons were equipped with the TBD Devastator, an aircraft so outdated that pilots nicknamed it the TBED. Captain Taro Aoki of the Akagi had been confident, writing in his war diary, "The American Navy is a shattered force. After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific. The war will effectively be over." This confidence was not mere bravado. The Japanese had won every carrier engagement of the war. At the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month prior, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, they had sunk the USS Lexington, America's second largest carrier, while losing only the light carrier. They had raided Darwin with impunity, struck Ceylon without opposition, and operated freely from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese did not know on that morning would fill volumes. They were unaware that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo and Pearl Harbor had deciphered their JN-25 naval code. They did not realize that Admiral Nimitz had read their operational orders, knew their target was Midway, understood the composition of their force, and had positioned his carriers in ambush at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a veteran Zero pilot on the carrier, would later reflect, "We operated under the assumption that surprise was ours. We believed the Americans thought we were heading for Hawaii or the Aleutians. We believed they had at most one functional carrier in the Pacific. Every assumption was wrong, but we didn't know it until the bombs were falling." Commander Minoru Gender, the tactical mastermind who had planned Pearl Harbor, lay ill with pneumonia in his cabin aboard the Akagi. His absence from the bridge would prove critical. He alone, among the Japanese commanders, had advocated maintaining a permanent reserve of aircraft armed for anti-ship operations. His substitute, Commander Tomoto Oishi, lacked both Gender's intuition and his paranoia about American carriers. The Japanese also did not know that Yorktown was operational. Naval intelligence had confirmed she had been heavily damaged at Coral Sea, which was true. They estimated 3 months minimum for repairs, which would have been accurate for any Japanese shipyard. They could not fathom that American workers at Pearl Harbor had completed 3 months of repairs in 3 days, that welders had worked continuously while the ship was underway, and that her elevators had been restored while she sailed toward Midway. 4:30 a.m. on June 4, Admiral Nagumo had launched 7 scout planes to search for American ships. This was already a compromise. Doctrine called for dozens of scouts, but Nagumo wanted to preserve his aircraft for the strike on Midway. Each scout would fly a single line 300 miles out and back, leaving vast stretches of ocean unchecked. The most critical search line, number 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult malfunctions. This single mechanical failure would place Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at the worst possible moment for the Japanese, when their decks were empty or crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Petty Officer First Class Amari, a scout plane observer from the battleship Haruna, later testified, "We flew our assign line seeing nothing but empty ocean. We were trained to see what we expected. Merchant ships, maybe a cruiser. Nobody was looking for American carriers because nobody thought American carriers were there." At 4:30 a.m., while it was still dark, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike on Midway, 36 Zero fighters, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. Lieutenant Tamanega led the strike. His aircraft carried a radio that would soon transmit the message, triggering a chain of fatal decisions. The Midway strike force encountered fierce opposition. American fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, were waiting at altitude, warned by radar. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and precise. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft and had 14 heavily damaged. More critically, Tamanega radioed at 7 a.m., "There is need for a second attack wave." This message arrived just as Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his career. He had 93 aircraft in reserve, torpedo planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attack. American B-17s from Midway were bombing his fleet from high altitude, ineffectively but forcing evasive maneuvers. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just attacked, also ineffectively, but demonstrating Midway's continued offensive capability. Commander Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued for maintaining the anti-ship armament. "Sir, we should keep the reserve armed for ship attack. We have heard nothing from our scouts, but that doesn't mean there are no American ships." But Nagumo, under pressure from the attacks and influenced by Tamaga's message, made the fateful decision at 7:15 a.m. remove torpedoes, load bombs for land attack. What followed was controlled chaos that would prove fatal. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber carried either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800 kg land attack bomb. Switching between them required rolling the aircraft to the hangar deck via elevator, removing the torpedo using special carriages, mounting the bomb using different attachment points, adjusting the release mechanism for different ballistics, returning the aircraft to the flight deck, and refueling for a different mission. Profile: Aviation Ordnance Man 2nd St. Shirmeda on the car later described the scene. "We worked like demons. Torpedoes were stacked on the hangar deck because returning them to the magazine took too long. Fuel hoses were everywhere. We were refueling aircraft while changing weapons, something strictly forbidden, but necessary to save time. The hangar deck became a bomb with a lit fuse, but we didn't think about it. We had done this drill hundreds of times." On the Aggie, the situation was even more complex. The ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could carry either 250 kg general-purpose bombs or 242 kg semi-armor-piercing bombs. The latter were for ships, the former for land targets. Crews had to not only change bombs, but change bomb types, each requiring different fuses and mounting brackets. At 7:28 a.m., as the frantic rearming continued, Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its turn point. Pilot Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari was about to turn back when he spotted white wakes on the horizon. His radioed report was vague. "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degree. Distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo received this message at 7:40 a.m. 10 ships could mean anything: destroyers, transports, cruisers, nothing requiring the urgent attention of his carrier force. He continued the rearming for land attack while ordering the scout to ascertain ship types and maintain contact. 7:55 a.m., Nagumo received a message that would later haunt him. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded the bridge. Cruisers and destroyers, no carriers. The rearming could continue. Some officers even celebrated. Catching an American surface force without air cover would be excellent hunting. But at 8:09 a.m., another message arrived, this one correcting the previous report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The bridge of the Akagi erupted in controlled panic. A carrier, even one carrier, changed everything. Within seconds, Nagumo issued new orders. Suspend rearming, leave torpedoes on aircraft that still have them, prepare to launch ship attack immediately. But the situation below decks had passed the point of no return. Half the aircraft had bombs attached but not fused. Others had torpedoes partially mounted. Some were on the flight deck with bombs, others in the hangar with torpedoes. To launch a coordinated strike, all aircraft needed to be armed the same way. They needed at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion or return to torpedoes. The situation was actually worse than anyone knew. The returning midway strike force was now approaching the carriers, low on fuel, many damaged, all needing to land immediately. Navy doctrine was absolute. You recovered your aircraft first, then launched new strikes. To do otherwise would mean losing dozens of aircraft and, more critically, their veteran pilots. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second fatal decision. Recover the midway strike force first, then we will deal with the American carrier. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:17 a.m., all four Japanese carriers focused on recovering the midway strike force. This operation, even under ideal circumstances, was complex. Clear the flight deck of aircraft, turn into the wind, recover aircraft in sequence. Damaged aircraft first, then fighters, lowest fuel, then bombers, strike aircraft below immediately to clear deck space, refuel, and rearm recovered aircraft, spot new aircraft for launch. What the Japanese didn't know was that time had already run out. 2 a.m., Admiral Spruant on the Enterprise had made the most important decision of his career. Launch everything immediately at maximum range, without waiting to coordinate a proper strike. His Air Operations Officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had protested, "Admiral, we'll be launching at extreme range. Many planes won't make it back." Spruant's reply was prophetic. "We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable." The American carrier launch between 7:02 and 8:06 a.m. was barely controlled. Chaos that would have appalled Japanese naval aviation instructors. Instead of a coordinated strike package, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arriving simultaneously, each squadron launched as soon as it was ready and proceeded independently. From Enterprise, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters from Hornet, 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters from Yorktown. Launching 2 hours later, 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a disaster by Japanese standards. Squadrons became separated. Fighters flew at different altitudes from bombers. Radio discipline collapsed. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons in wrong directions. The Hornets fighters and dive bombers never found the Japanese fleet at all, running out of fuel and ditching or returning to base. Enan George Gay, torpedo bomber, pilot from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, later described the scene. "We launched knowing we probably wouldn't make it back. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, told us straight, we're going alone. We'll probably all be killed, but we're going to hit those carriers." We flew off separately from our fighters and dive bombers. It was suicide, but it was also our job. At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese aircraft from the midway strike landed, radar on the Soryu detected incoming aircraft low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron, 15 obsolete torpedo bombers without fighter escort, had found the Japanese fleet through brilliant navigation and sheer determination. The massacre was complete. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down. 29 of 30 aircrew were killed. Only Enan Gay survived, hiding under his seat cushion in the water, watching what came next. not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. But the sacrifice, seemingly futile, had achieved something crucial. The Zeros had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced into evasive maneuvers, unable to spot aircraft for launch, and most critically, the attention of every Japanese lookout was focused down at the water, not up at the sky. 10:36 a.m., VT-6 from Enterprise arrived. 14 more torpedo bombers, also without escort. They too were massacred, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a hit. At 10 a.m., Yorktown's VT-3 arrived. 12 more torpedo bombers with a handful of fighters. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft, again, scoring no hits. At 10:20 a.m., the last of the American torpedo bombers was either destroyed or fleeing. The Japanese carriers began recovering their Zeros, now low on ammunition and fuel, from the slaughter. Victory seemed complete. Not a single torpedo had hit and 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally relaxed his operations. Officer reported, "Sir, we can be ready to launch our strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes. All aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." The flight decks of all 4 carriers were packed with aircraft. The Akagi had 40 aircraft on deck, fueled and armed. The Kaga had 30. The Sorya had 33. The Hiru, further north, had 38. Fuel hoses were still connected to aircraft. Ordnance crews were making final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mountings. Pilots were in their cockpits, engines warming up. Lieutenant Commander Wide McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in circles, searching for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Low on fuel, McCluskey had made a guess. Follow a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northeast. That guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their dives from 14,500 feet. The Zeros were at sea level, refueling. The anti-aircraft guns were trained horizontally for torpedo defense. The decks were covered with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading bombing Squadron 6, selected the Aggie as his target. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The carrier was turning into the wind, her deck packed with aircraft. I could see crew running on the deck, fuel hoses being dropped, aircraft trying to start engines. They had maybe 60 seconds warning, not nearly enough." At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000 pounds bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. It exploded in the hangar deck among torpedoes and bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against all safety regulations in the hangar. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on the car. 4 bombs hit the massive carrier in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb hit forward, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his entire staff instantly. The subsequent bombs hit among the packed aircraft on deck. The induced explosions were catastrophic. The 80,000 tons of fuel, torpedoes, and bombs aboard Kaga began exploding in sequence. Within minutes, the ship was an inferno from stem to stern. The heat was so intense that firefighting crews couldn't get within 50 feet of the flames. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost the same moment, targeting the Soryu. 3 1,000 pounds bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line down the flight deck. The first exploded in the forward hangar. The second hit amidship among packed aircraft. The third destroyed the rear elevator. The Sorya had a particular vulnerability. She carried extra aviation fuel in tanks along the hangar deck sides to extend her aircraft range. These tanks ruptured immediately, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At 10:31 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the American attack was over. McCluskey's dive bombers were heading home, many running on fumes. In just 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning hulks. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock on the bridge as explosions rocked the ship beneath him. His operations officer, Commander Roishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed impossible. Flight deck destroyed, hangar deck in flames, all aircraft lost, steering control lost, communications destroyed. Captain Taro Aoki grabbed Nagumo, who seemed paralyzed. Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost. On the car, the situation was even worse. With the captain and senior officers killed in the first bomb hit, command devolved to the damage control officer who was trapped below decks by fire. The Soryu was dying fastest. Captain Reisaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge even as flames approached. His final order heard by several survivors was, "Save yourselves. I will remain with Soryu." He was last seen lashing himself to the helm, determined to go down with his ship. In the minutes following 10:31 a.m., the Japanese Navy faced a crisis beyond anything in their planning or experience. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been eliminated in less time than it took to conduct a single landing operation. On the Hiru, the only surviving carrier, Admiral Tamman Yamaguchi, watched in horror as smoke columns rose from his 3 sister ships. The mathematics were devastating. In 11 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft on deck, 40 plus aircraft in hangars, 50 plus aircraft aloft with nowhere to land, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel. The scene aboard the burning carriers defied description. On the Aggie, induced explosions continued for hours. Each explosion sent sheets of steel flying like scythes through compartments packed with men. The hangar deck became a crematorium. On the car, the ship's size, she was a converted battleship, meant more compartments, more trapped men. The fires above made rescue impossible. The bulkheads were so hot they glowed. Hundreds died trapped in steel compartments. The Saru's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, survived to describe the engine room catastrophe. The first bomb severed steam lines. Superheated steam at 400 degrees filled the compartments instantly. Men were literally steamed alive. Others suffocated as the fires consumed all oxygen. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiria faced an impossible situation with characteristic aggression. Despite having only one carrier against 3 American ones, he immediately ordered a counterstrike. At 10:58 a.m., just 27 minutes after the American attack, Hiru launched 18 Naval dive bombers and 6 fighters. The strike found Yorktown at 12 p.m. Despite facing prepared defenses and radar-directed fighter interception, the veterans pressed home their attack. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, starting fires and damaging her boilers. The American carrier slowed to a stop. Yamaguchi immediately ordered a second strike. At 1:31 p.m., 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros launched. This tiny force found Yorktown again at 2:42 p.m. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half the attackers, they put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tamanega, who had led the morning Midway strike, led this final attack. His plane had been damaged over Midway, its left-wing fuel tank hold. He knew he didn't have enough fuel to return, but launched anyway. His torpedo was one of the 2 that hit. His plane crashed into the sea immediately after having run out of fuel. 5:03 p.m., the inevitable occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found Hiyu. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into another inferno. Captain Tomo Kaku of the Hiyu, mortally wounded, gave his last order: scuttle the ship, save the crew. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard. His final message to his staff: I will apologize to the Emperor for the defeat. You will rebuild the Navy. As the Japanese carriers burned, the surviving officers began to understand the magnitude of their intelligence failure. The evidence was overwhelming in retrospect. American carriers at precisely the right position. Midway fully alerted and prepared. Submarines positioned along Japanese approach routes. Strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the right time. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer of the combined fleet, would later write, "We realized that the Americans had read our mail. Every message, every order, every plan. We had been performing for an audience that knew the script. The surprise we thought we possessed had actually belonged to them. Beyond the intelligence failure, the battle revealed fundamental truths about carrier warfare that the Japanese had not understood. Their entire doctrine, massed carrier operations, coordinated strikes, holding reserves, had been correct, but they had failed to execute it under pressure. The American dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, had proved superior to the vaunted Japanese Val in the only metric that mattered, survivability while delivering ordnance. The American doctrine of deck load strikes rather than hangar storage meant they could launch faster. The American damage control procedures, which the Japanese had mocked as overcautious, had already saved Yorktown once and would save other carriers throughout the war. As night fell on June 4, thousands of Japanese sailors were in the water or crowded aboard destroyers. The three carriers were still afloat, but burning, abandoned hulks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors refused rescue, believing they had failed the Emperor. Men would swim away from rescue lines, shouting, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years, and then dive under, holding their breath until they drowned." What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans believed they were losing even as they won. Admiral Spruant, receiving reports of his missing squadrons, calculated he had lost over half his aircraft. Yorktown was crippled and listing Japanese submarines were reported everywhere. Spruant's decision to continue the engagement despite uncertainty would prove crucial. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that evening, confirming the magnitude of the victory. But even then, the Americans didn't fully understand what they had achieved. June 5 brought cruel confirmation of American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine 168 dispatched by Yamamoto found Yorktown under tow barely moving. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanab fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer Hammond alongside. Yorktown would sink on June 7, the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then the outcome was decided. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, scuttled by their own destroyers when it became clear they couldn't be saved. The human cost of those 11 minutes continued to mount for days. The Akagi was scuttled at 5 a.m. on June 5 after burning for 19 hours. The cargo sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4, taking 811 men with her. The Soria went under at 7:13 p.m. on June 4 with 711 souls. The Hiru lingered until 9 a.m. on June 5, before disappearing beneath the waves with 392 men. The total Japanese death toll from the 4 carriers was 2,181. But these weren't just sailors. They were the experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines, the armorers who could mount torpedoes in minutes, the fuel handlers who could conduct underway replenishment, the veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato 300M behind the carrier force received the reports in silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described the scene. The admiral sat completely still for nearly an hour after learning of the 4th carrier's loss. Then he said quietly, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." Yamamoto understood what others would take months to grasp. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers. In 6 months, they had lost 5. They could build new carriers, and they would, but they couldn't replace the trained crews. A carrier pilot required 2 years of training. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling to operate efficiently. The mathematics were inexorable. America had launched 17 new carriers by the time Japan managed to commission 1. American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 pilots per month by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 per month and couldn't replace losses. The survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that affected the entire Japanese Navy. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The confidence that had driven operations from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated in 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted new procedures based on Midway's lessons. Combat air patrol always retained at altitude. Decks kept clear, and less immediately launching. Ordnance returned to magazines immediately. Multiple search patterns. Overlapping. Radio silence abandoned for tactical communication. But these changes came too late and addressed the symptoms, not the cause. The cause was that American intelligence, production, and innovation had already surpassed Japan. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created a different transformation, from desperate defenders to confident aggressors. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized by Pearl Harbor, had discovered it could not just fight the Japanese Navy, but destroy it. Admiral Nimitz, receiving confirmation of the victory, told his staff, "They are not supermen. They can be beaten. They have been beaten. Now we take the offensive." The tactical lessons were immediately incorporated. Dive bombers were supreme ship killers. Coordinated strikes were ideal, but not essential. First strike advantage was decisive. Radar directed. Fighter control was crucial. Damage control could save seemingly doomed ships. But the most important lesson was psychological. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornets' VT-8, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, put it simply, we had stood up to the best they had and destroyed it. After that, we knew we would win the war. It was just a matter of time and blood. Post-war analysis revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in devastating detail. American dive bombers had achieved approximately 52% hit rates at Midway, far above normal training statistics. They had achieved them at the perfect moment. The Japanese had shot down 35 of 41 torpedo bombers, an 85% kill rate, but those sacrificial attacks had created the conditions for the dive bombers' success. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval theorists call the vulnerable window. That moment when a carrier is most helpless. Aircraft being serviced preventing defensive maneuvers. Fuel lines connected making fire inevitable. Ordnance exposed multiplying any damage. Attention focused elsewhere, preventing early detection. Commander Joseph Rashford, the intelligence officer whose Costa Ricans had made the ambush possible, observed, "We won because we knew when they would be vulnerable, and we were lucky enough to catch them exactly then." 5 minutes earlier or later and the battle ends differently. Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers lie in Midway's deep waters, war graves for thousands. Oceanographer Robert Ballard's expeditions have found Yorktown at 16,650 feet and Kegger at 17,700 feet. Their hulks accounts testify to those 11 minutes. Recent expeditions in 2023 have provided detailed surveys of these wrecks, now safeguarded within the Papahanaumoekua Marine National Monument. Survivors established commemorative markers on both sides. At memorial services, former adversaries met as friends, united in acknowledgement of a battle that reshaped history. The Japanese Navy's effort to conceal Midway's outcome from its populace, isolating survivors, binding them to secrecy, claiming triumph while masking defeat, eroded morale throughout the fleet and established a pattern of deception that persisted until the war's conclusion. Historians have long debated how those 11 minutes might have unfolded differently if Tone Scout had launched on schedule, though paradoxically, modern research shows the delay actually aided the Japanese in locating the Americans sooner than expected. If Nagumo had retained a reserve strike, if the American torpedo bombers had not engaged, if McCluskey had avoided following that destroyer. Yet history offers no alternative timelines. What transpired in those 11 minutes altered everything. Contemporary military strategists continue to examine Midway for lessons relevant to modern conflict. Information dominance remains decisive. First strike advantage in advanced warfare typically dictates outcomes. All military systems experience moments of peak vulnerability. Individual choices under pressure continue to shape results. Superior systems can overcome superior warriors. Through letters, diaries, and interviews compiled over decades, survivors provided intimate portrayals of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese narratives converge on the chaos, heroism, terror, and transformation that occurred in those pivotal moments. The U.S. Naval War College's analysis concludes, Midway's 11 minutes remain the benchmark for decisive military action. Never before or since has such a brief interval so thoroughly reversed strategic reality. Economic historians estimate that those 11 minutes cost Japan roughly 2 billion yen in 1942 currency, about 15% of Japan's yearly military budget. The indirect costs, however, were far greater. pilot training programs accelerated, diminishing quality. Resources were diverted from other projects to replace carriers. Industrial output strained beyond sustainable limits. Technical development rushed, introducing design flaws. Conversely, America found its war economy vindicated. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced within months. The industrial apparatus that seemed insurmountable to Japanese observers was merely warming up. In Japanese culture, Midway became a symbol of nemesis, the instant when hubris meets reality. The term Midway syndrome entered business lexicon, describing overconfidence leading to catastrophic failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka, writing post-war, observed, "Those 11 minutes taught Japan that the era of the samurai was over." Individual courage, skill, and dedication counted for nothing against systematic intelligence, overwhelming production, and technological superiority. We entered those 11 minutes as warriors. We emerged as relics. Survivors from both sides bore unique psychological burdens. American dive bomber pilots who delivered death often suffered survivor's guilt. Japanese sailors who survived the inferno endured shame for outliving their ships. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb destroyed the Kaga, never flew again due to tuberculosis triggered by inhaling caustic soda from his aircraft's oxygen system. He spent decades reflecting on the men he killed with that single perfectly placed bomb. "I did my duty," he said in 1995. "But duty does not lessen the understanding that my success meant death for hundreds performing their duty." Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with precision, revealing how narrow the margin truly was. Had American dive bombers arrived 5 minutes later, Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and at altitude. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, Japanese decks would not have been crowded with aircraft. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower, the dive bombers could not have struck. If wind direction differed, carriers would have been unable to launch or recover planes. The simulations concluded that those 11 minutes represented the sole window in a 2-hour period when Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable. The Americans struck that window flawlessly. Military doctrine worldwide evolved based on those 11 minutes. Carriers began operating in dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrols maintained multiple altitude layers continuously. Deckload strikes became standard, minimizing hangar exposure. Damage control gained equal importance to offensive capability. Intelligence collection received equal priority with operations. The U.S. Navy completely revised its carrier warfare manual based on Midway's lessons. The Japanese Navy could not implement the recommended changes due to insufficient resources to maintain continuous air patrol or rapid rearmament. Ultimately, those 11 minutes hinged on individual human choices made under extreme stress. McCluskey following the destroyer, Best's split-second target selection, Nagumo's faithful rearm order, Spruance's calculated risk at maximum range, pilots pressing attacks despite certain death. Admiral Spruance later reflected, "We succeeded because our mistakes were recoverable, and theirs were not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese misstep was magnified, every American gamble rewarded. It was not justice or destiny, it was probability catching up with risk. At Midway's 75th anniversary in 2017, surviving participants spoke at the commemoration. Their words conveyed the weight of those 11 minutes that defined the 20th century. History remembers those moments as both glory and necessary horror. They define not just a battle but an era, proving that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. Intelligence, technology, and industrial capability proved more decisive than tradition, training, and tactical skill. Individual decisions at critical junctures could outweigh years of preparation. Between 10:20 and 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the course of history shifted. 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy and instruments of Pacific domination, were transformed into burning wrecks. American aircraft, launched in desperate, improvised attacks, achieved the seemingly impossible, a decisive victory against a superior force. Those 11 minutes demonstrated that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. Intelligence, technology, and production capacity outweigh tradition, training, and tactical prowess, and critical decisions can surpass long-term preparation. Japanese pilots who had dominated the Pacific for 6 months discovered in 11 minutes that their supremacy was an illusion built on temporary advantage. American pilots, previously dismissed as inferior, discovered they could destroy the world's premier naval force when conditions aligned. In those 11 minutes, 2,181 Japanese sailors and aviators would die on the 4 carriers, joined by 307 Americans, transforming abstract strategy into human tragedy. Their sacrifice, voluntary and involuntary, victorious and defeated, created the pivotal turning point of the Pacific War. The sinking carriers carried not just steel, fuel, and ammunition, but aspirations of empire, assumptions of superiority, and belief in destiny. They left behind widows, fatherless children, and nations forced to reconcile myth with reality. Today, the Pacific waters flow peacefully over Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests nearby, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same deep waters. They remain monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men died for causes they believed in, and when the modern world was born through violence that lasted less time than a coffee break. Those 11 minutes offer history's most compressed lesson on the futility of military hubris, the power of intelligence and innovation, and the enormous cost of strategic miscalculation. They remind us that in warfare, as in life, everything can change in moments, that superiority is fleeting, and the price of error is measured in blood. Admiral Nagumo, who survived those 11 minutes but never recovered, wrote before his death on Saipan in 1944, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by warriors but by systems." In 11 minutes, the American system destroyed our warrior tradition. We believed we were fighting the last war better. They were fighting the next war first. Those 11 minutes were not a battle, they were the execution of obsolescence by innovation. The American aircraft launched while Japanese pilots experienced those 11 minutes changed more than the Pacific War. They changed how humanity would fight, conceptualize, and remember conflict. In those 11 minutes, the age of the warrior ended, and the age of the technologist began. The world has never been the same.